Shaquille O'Neal exited a lavish hotel in the heart of the city, the sunlight glinting off his finely tailored suit as he approached the shining black SUV awaiting him. Suddenly, a frail, thin, pale girl rushed forward and clung to his leg. Before Shaq could say anything, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear and urgency. A look that would alter everything. Can you guess what came next? If you enjoy uplifting stories like this, remember to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. The sunset cast golden hues over the downtown skyscrapers as the day came to an end. Dressed impeccably in his suit, Shaquille O'Neal stepped out from the grand glass doors of a luxury hotel. His tall stature instantly attracted the attention of the busy crowd. The charity event he had just attended had been a great success, and his sleek black SUV was parked at the curb, prepared to take him home. Amid the urban hustle, with cars honking and pedestrians flowing, Shaq maintained a relaxed smile while chatting with his driver, Marcus. He was just bending down to enter the vehicle when a small figure dashed out from the crowd. The child appeared to be no older than 10, her thin frame highlighted by dirt-streaked bare feet. What shocked Shaq most was her pale, sickly complexion. Without uttering a word, she clung to his leg, trembling, her wide eyes darting nervously as if escaping something frightening. Shaq crouched down, his deep, warm voice breaking the tension. "Are you okay? What's happening?" The girl stayed silent, avoiding his gaze. Her tiny hands grasped his pant leg as if holding onto a delicate thread of hope. Before Shaq could inquire further, an angry voice called out from across the street. "Stop right there, you little troublemaker." A middle-aged man in a grease-stained apron hurried toward them, his flushed face twisted with annoyance. Startled, the girl released Shaq's leg and fled into the crowd, disappearing so quickly that he only caught a brief glimpse of her retreating form. The man approached, panting heavily and seemingly unaware of who he was addressing. "That kid. She's always loitering around my shop, never buys anything, just touches everything and bothers my customers. This time I'm calling the cops." Shaq raised an eyebrow, his irritation barely concealed. Responding in a calm yet firm tone, he asked, "Did she steal something from you?" The man hesitated, his gaze shifting uncomfortably. "Well, not exactly, but she keeps wandering around, staring at the shelves and making my customers uneasy. Kids like her just bring trouble." Shaq crossed his arms, his expression contemplative. His mind replayed the haunting look in the girl's eyes, a blend of fear, desperation, and a silent cry for help. The man opened his mouth to complain further but froze upon realizing he was speaking to Shaquille O'Neal. Stammering an apology, he quickly walked away. Shaq stood beside the SUV, scanning the direction the girl had fled. A profound sense of curiosity and compassion stirred within him. One question lingered in his mind. What was she escaping, and why did she need help so urgently? Shaquille O'Neal stood still for a few moments, his gaze fixed on the little girl who had just vanished into the crowd. A strange feeling washed over him, a pull he couldn't ignore. Turning to Marcus, his voice steady and deep, he said, "Marcus, slow down. We need to find that girl." Marcus raised an eyebrow, but quickly nodded. Having worked for Shaq for years, he was accustomed to unexpected requests from his boss, even if this one felt offbeat. The black SUV rolled slowly through the busy streets of downtown. Outside the window, the city buzzed with noise, the chatter of pedestrians, the honking of horns, and the relentless rhythm of urban life creating a chaotic symphony. Shaq kept his eyes fixed on the sidewalks, scanning every alley and corner, searching for the small figure with the shaven head that had made a lasting impression on him. "Where do you think she might have gone?" Marcus asked, his focus on the traffic ahead. "I don't know," Shaq replied, his eyes never straying from the sidewalk. "But she needs help. Something frightened her so much that she had to run. I need to understand what's going on." After nearly 10 minutes of searching, Shaq spotted a small figure huddled on the curb near a convenience store. His heart raced as he recognized her. Emma. That was the name he had started calling her in his mind, despite not knowing her real name. She sat on the sidewalk, clutching a small paper cup filled with a few coins. Her frail shoulders trembled beneath a thin, tattered jacket. Passers-by hurriedly moved around her, barely acknowledging her existence as if she were just another invisible part of the city. Shaq signaled Marcus to stop the vehicle and stepped out. His tall figure and commanding presence instantly drew some curious glances, but his focus was solely on the girl. Approaching slowly to avoid scaring her, Shaq crouched down, his deep voice soft and gentle. "Hi there, are you okay?" Emma looked up, her eyes wide with a mix of surprise and fear, but this time she didn't run. She simply sat there, clutching the paper cup as if it were a lifeline. Shaq sat down on the curb, lowering himself to her level to reduce the intimidating height difference. He offered a small smile. "My name's Shaq. Can you tell me your name?" After a brief hesitation, she mumbled, "Emma." Shaq nodded, his gaze filled with compassion. "Emma, I saw you earlier. Do you need help?" Emma didn't respond right away. Her eyes darted nervously around, as if expecting someone to suddenly appear. Shaq followed her gaze and noticed a man across the street, glaring at them. He resembled the store owner from earlier, his expression stern and accusatory. "Are you afraid of him?" Shaq asked, tilting his head slightly toward the man. Emma didn't answer, but the way she tightened her grip on the cup conveyed everything. Taking a deep breath, Shaq turned to Marcus, who was leaning against the SUV. "Marcus, keep a watchful eye. Don't let anyone come near us." When Shaq's expression softened again, Emma seemed to realize she was safe. Several minutes passed in silence before she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I need help, but not money." Shaq leaned in closer, concern deepening in his expression. "What do you need, Emma? Please tell me." Emma hesitated, then slowly rolled up her sleeve, revealing a large bruise and an unusual discoloration along her thin arm. A chill ran down Shaq's spine. "What's this? Did someone hurt you?" Emma shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. Her voice quivered as she whispered, "The doctor said I need medicine, but I don't have money, and no one will help me." In that moment, it felt as if the world around Shaq had come to a standstill. His gaze settled on Emma's trembling shoulders, and he knew he couldn't simply walk away. She needed him more than ever. She needed someone to care. "I'll help you, Emma," Shaq stated firmly. "We're going to resolve this right now." Emma looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of doubt and a glimmer of hope. For the first time that day, she didn't shy away from his gaze. "Do you promise?" she asked softly. Shaq nodded, his expression resolute. "I promise." Shaquille O'Neal looked deeply into Emma's eyes, where a spark of hope had just ignited. After making his promise, he slowly stood up and extended his hand toward her. "Come on, Emma. I'll take you somewhere safe." Emma hesitated momentarily, but the steady look in his eyes and his warm smile provided her with comfort. She reached out and took his hand, her small trembling fingers dwarfed by his large palm. Marcus quickly opened the SUV door, and Shaq assisted Emma in climbing inside. The SUV glided through the busy streets, the atmosphere inside tense yet quiet. Sitting beside Emma, Shaq observed her closely, noticing how her frail hands clutched the hem of her shirt, as if trying to suppress her fear. "Emma, where do you live?" Shaq asked gently, though his voice revealed his concern. "At Street Helena Orphanage," she answered softly, "but they don't have enough money to take care of me." Shaq frowned, leaning forward. "Can't take care of you? What do you mean?" Emma hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor of the vehicle. She rolled up her sleeve, revealing a dark bruise stretching along her pale, dry skin. The deep, unnatural discoloration sent a chill down Shaq's spine. "The doctor said I'm sick. It's a type of cancer," Emma said, her voice quaking. "I need medicine, but the orphanage can't afford it. I thought if I could gather enough money, maybe they'd help me." Shaq stared at her, his eyes wide with shock and heartache. A child so thin, so fragile, burdened with a struggle that no one should endure alone. "You've been asking for money to save yourself?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Emma nodded, her eyes filled with despair. "I don't want to bother anyone, but I don't want to die." Shaq turned to Marcus, meeting his gaze in the rearview mirror. His voice was firm with determination. Marcus, drive straight to the nearest hospital. We can't waste any time. Marcus nodded and accelerated without a word. Shaq looked back at Emma, gently placing one of his large hands on her thin shoulder. Listen to me, Emma, he said, his voice warm yet steady. You're not facing this alone anymore. I'll handle everything, okay? All you need to do is stay strong and trust me. Emma gazed up at him, tears filling her eyes but now accompanied by a flicker of hope. You'll really help me. Shaq smiled, his expression sincere and reassuring. I promise, and I never break my promises. When the SUV arrived at the hospital, Shaq lifted Emma into his arms, ignoring the curious stares of onlookers. She felt as light as a feather in his secure embrace. Inside, the medical staff immediately recognized Shaquille O'Neal, but before anyone could say a word, he firmly stated, "This child needs to be examined immediately. She can't wait another moment." The doctors rushed Emma into an examination room while Shaq stood in the hallway, a whirlwind of emotions swirling within him. He thought about how Emma had been battling alone, not just against her illness, but against the indifference and cruelty of the world. Marcus approached him cautiously. Shaq, what are you truly planning to do? This kid doesn't just need some money. She needs a long-term solution. Without delay, Shaq turned to him, determination blazing in his eyes. I'll do whatever is necessary, Marcus. No child should have to fight for survival on their own. When the examination room door opened and a doctor emerged with a serious expression, Shaq realized that his journey with Emma was just beginning. The SUV sped through the busy streets, streetlights casting faint streaks of light across Shaquille O'Neal's thoughtful face. Emma sat in the back seat, leaning against the window, her shallow breaths heightening Shaq's growing concern. How are you feeling, Emma? Shaq asked gently, though his voice hinted at his tension. Emma attempted a weak smile. I'm okay, just a bit tired. As the car turned a corner, Shaq glanced back at her. Her eyelids were beginning to droop, her head tilting slightly. He could feel the fragility of the young girl, as if a strong gust of wind could sweep her away. When the car halted in front of a dilapidated building, the orphanage where Emma lived, Shaq opened the door, ready to assist her out. But as soon as he touched her shoulder, Emma collapsed against him. Emma! Shaq exclaimed, panic flooding his voice. He scooped her up, his strong arms effortlessly cradling her small, lightweight frame. Marcus, hurry. Drive to the nearest hospital. Shaq yelled over his shoulder, worry etched deeply on his face. The SUV sped through the streets, drawing curious glances from passers-by. Inside, Shaq held Emma tightly, feeling the faint rhythm of her breaths. Stay with me, Emma. I'm right here, he murmured, as if his words alone could keep her conscious. At the hospital, medical staff rushed to assist Emma, placing her on a stretcher and quickly taking her to the emergency room. Shaq followed closely behind, each step heavy with concern for her. Doctor, please help her, he pleaded, his voice desperate. A nurse placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. We'll do everything we can, but you'll need to wait outside, she said. Shaq reluctantly stopped, his gaze fixed on Emma as she was wheeled through the large emergency doors. While he waited, a middle-aged woman with streaked silver hair entered the lobby, spotting Shaq. She paused before walking toward him, worry in her eyes. Are you the one who brought Emma in? She asked, her voice gentle but anxious. Shaq nodded. Yes, she fainted on the way. And you are? I'm Margaret, the manager of the orphanage where Emma lives, she replied, her eyes dropping sadly. I just received a call from the nurse. How is she? Shaq shook his head, struggling to hold himself together. I don't know. The doctors are still examining her, he said. Margaret sighed deeply, her hands trembling as she clutched an old handbag. Emma has been through so much. I'm afraid she can't hold on much longer without proper help, she said, her voice heavy. Shaq looked at her, sensing the sadness in her voice. Can you tell me what's wrong with her? He asked. Margaret sat down, her eyes full of years of hardship. Emma was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer 6 months ago, she explained. The tumor has spread to her lymphatic system, and the doctor said that if she doesn't get treatment soon, she won't survive. Her voice broke. but the orphanage doesn't have the funds. Shaq finished the thought, his heart aching. She couldn't get the treatment because of money. Margaret nodded, tears filling her eyes. We've done all we can, but it's not enough. Emma overheard the doctors talking and figured out we couldn't afford the treatment. Since then, she's been sneaking out, trying to beg for money to save herself. I tried to stop her, but she's so determined. She doesn't want to be a burden. Shaq's heart tightened as he thought about the look in Emma's eyes when she said she needed help, but not money. All the pieces of her story began to make sense, and it broke him. Just then, the emergency room doors opened, and a doctor stepped out, his expression serious. "Are you the one who brought her in?" he asked. Shaq nodded, stepping forward. "I'm her guardian. How is she?" The doctor looked at Shaq, his face grim. "She's in critical condition. We've stabilized her, but she needs long-term treatment. The tumor has spread, and without immediate intervention, her chances are slim." Shaq clenched his fists. "Do whatever it takes." "I'll cover all the expenses," he said, his voice resolute. The doctor, surprised, nodded quickly. "We'll do everything we can." Shaq followed the doctor into the room. As he approached Emma's bed, she opened her eyes weakly, her small hand clutching the blanket tightly. "You won't leave me, will you?" she asked in a fragile voice, fearing the answer might break her. Shaq leaned down, his voice firm. "Never. I promise you." Shaquille O'Neal stood quietly beside Emma's bed, his gaze fixed on her pale face, her soft, trembling voice echoing in his mind. The promises he had made were more than words. They were vows he would not break. The doctor approached, holding Emma's medical file. "Mr. O'Neal," he began, his voice serious, "Emma needs immediate, intensive treatment. We've stabilized her for now, but she'll require chemotherapy and radiation therapy to stop the spread of cancer. The cost will be significant, and the recovery will be long." Shaq took a deep breath, his eyes locked on the doctor. "I don't care about the cost. Do whatever is necessary. Emma deserves a chance at life." The doctor nodded, impressed by Shaq's determination. "We'll begin treatment as soon as we get consent." Shaq turned to Margaret, who was standing nearby with tear-filled eyes. "Mrs. Margaret, I'll cover all the expenses for Emma." "From now on, she'll get everything she needs to get better," he said. Margaret was speechless, her lips trembling. She could only nod in gratitude. As the doctor prepared the paperwork, Shaq stepped outside and pulled out his phone to contact his manager. He knew this decision would have consequences once the news went public. His phone began buzzing with messages, including one from Jim, his longtime manager. Shaq sighed and answered. "Shaq, where are you? The press conference has started. Hundreds of people are waiting for you," Jim said, his voice tense. Shaq replied calmly but firmly. "I can't make it," Jim nearly shouted. "Do you realize what this will do to your contracts, your sponsors, your reputation?" Shaq cut him off. "I don't care about my reputation or contracts right now. There's a little girl fighting for her life, and I'm not leaving until I know she's getting the help she needs." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Jim sighed. "I understand, but Shaq, there will be consequences." Shaq closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his decision. "If there are consequences, I'll face them. Sometimes doing the right thing is the hardest thing." When Shaq returned to Emma's room, she was awake. She turned her head weakly, her eyes brightening when she saw him. "You came back," she whispered. Shaq smiled, sitting down beside her. "I told you I would. I'm not leaving." Emma looked at him, her eyes filled with both gratitude and fear. "I'm scared, Uncle Shaq. I don't know if I can make it," she said softly. Shaq gently took her small hand in his gaze steady and comforting. "Listen to me, Emma. I know this is hard, but you're so brave and you're not going through this alone. I'll be with you every step of the way. You don't have to face this on your own." Emma looked up, her face streaked with tears. "I promise," Shaq said, gripping her hand firmly. "I promise I'll stay until you're better. This is a big challenge, but we're going to overcome it together." In that moment, surrounded by the stereo beeping of machines and the harsh hospital lighting, an unspoken bond was formed. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just a celebrity or a stranger passing through. He had become Emma's pillar of strength, her beacon of hope, and the companion she needed for the tough road ahead. The harsh, cold light from the hospital ceiling gave the hallway a sterile, almost eerie feel. Shaq sat quietly on a hard plastic chair in the waiting room, his hands clasped together as his eyes remained fixed on the closed doors of the operating room. Mrs. Margaret sat beside him, her anxiety clear as she gripped her well-worn purse tightly. Shaq had faced countless intense moments in his basketball career, but never had he felt so powerless. As he waited, his phone buzzed nonstop, texts, emails, and calls from his manager, business associates, and the media. One text from Jimmy caught his eye. "Shaq, we need to talk. Yesterday's press conference caused some issues." Shaq picked up the phone but quickly set it back down. He couldn't let these distractions take his focus away from Emma, who needed him now more than ever. "You don't have to stay here all day." Mrs. Margaret's voice was soft but full of gratitude as she spoke. "You have so many responsibilities. Getting Emma here was more than enough." Shaq turned to her with a steady gaze. "No, Mrs. Margaret, Emma needs me. I'm staying, no matter how long it takes." Tears welled up in her eyes as she whispered, "You truly are an incredible man, Mr. O'Neal." Time seemed to drag on forever. Seconds became minutes, then hours. Every time the operating room doors opened and a nurse stepped out, Shaq's heart skipped a beat, only to fall again when there was no word about Emma. He started pacing the hallway, his towering figure filling the space. No one said a word. They just watched the giant man, clearly filled with worry. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the doors to the operating room opened. The surgeon stepped out, still wearing his scrubs and mask, exhaustion visible in his eyes, but a look of professionalism remained. Shaq rushed forward, his eyes filled with both hope and fear. "How is Emma, doctor?" he asked, his voice tight. The surgeon looked at him for a moment before pulling down his mask to reveal a tired but reassuring smile. "The surgery was successful. We removed the tumor and affected lymph nodes, but—" Shaq's heart tightened. "But what?" he asked urgently. The doctor took a deep breath. "Her condition has progressed to stage 3. This means we can't guarantee that all the cancer cells were removed. Emma will need extensive chemotherapy and radiation to reduce the risk of it returning." Shaq took a deep breath, fighting back tears. He turned to Mrs. Margaret, who had her hands over her mouth, her face streaked with tears. "So there's still hope for her, right?" Shaq asked, his voice filled with determination. The doctor nodded. "Yes, but it will be a long, difficult journey. She'll need both medical care and emotional support." Shaq exhaled, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. "Thank you, doctor. Do whatever it takes. We won't let her go through this alone." When Shaq walked into the recovery room, he found Emma lying on the hospital bed, her eyes closed and her face pale but calm. The steady beeping of the machines surrounding her offered some comfort, reminding him that she was still fighting. He leaned down and took her small, cold hand in his. Despite its coldness, he felt a surge of emotion fill him. "Emma," he whispered as if she could hear him, "I promised I'd be here, and I'll keep that promise. You're going to get better, I know it." Although the surgery was a success, Shaq knew it was only the beginning. A long, grueling path lay ahead for Emma, and he would walk it with her. He understood it wouldn't just be Emma fighting this battle. It would also be him. But there was no room for doubt in his heart. He had made a promise, and he would keep it no matter the challenges ahead. Shaquille O'Neal sat in the hospital room, his eyes fixed on Emma, who was asleep. The constant beeping of the medical equipment surrounding her brought a faint sense of reassurance, but inside Shaq, a fire had been lit, not one of fear, but of determination. He knew that while Emma's surgery was just the first step, chemotherapy and radiation would be even tougher. Alongside these challenges, there were other battles to fight, battles that extended beyond Emma's room, touching a larger issue within the community. Mrs. Margaret entered the room, looking worn but visibly relieved as she saw Shaq by Emma's side. "Emma will be fine," she said softly, trying to smile. "Thank you for being here for her." Shaq turned to her, his face serious. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, not just about Emma, but about the orphanage and all the other kids there. I want to do more." Mrs. Margaret looked at him, surprised. "You've already done so much, Mr. O'Neill. Bringing Emma here and covering her expenses. We'll never forget it." Shaq shook his head. "Helping just Emma isn't enough. I want to help all the children at your orphanage. And not just that. I want to make sure no child ends up in Emma's situation without someone stepping in." Mrs. Margaret stared at him, disbelief in her eyes. "You mean?" Shaq straightened up in his chair, his large hands resting on his knees. His expression was resolute. "I want to start a charity, an organization that not only helps children with critical illnesses, but also works to improve the living conditions for the kids in your orphanage." Mrs. Margaret froze, her trembling hands covering her mouth. "Mr. O'Neill, do you really mean this? It's going to cost a fortune." "Money isn't the issue," Shaq interrupted, his voice firm. "I've been fortunate to have a successful career, but none of that matters if I can't use it to help those who need it most. I want to create a place where no child has to feel afraid anymore." A few days later, after Emma was moved to a general ward, Shaq arranged a private meeting with Mrs. Margaret in the hospital's administrative office. Shaq asked, his focus unwavering, "What does your orphanage need?" Mrs. Margaret paused for a moment, then pulled out an old folder filled with aged papers. "We need everything. The place is falling apart, the rooms are unsafe, and we don't have a medical room. Our daily meals depend on small donations, and sometimes we even have to reduce meals to save money." Shaq flipped through the pages, seeing pictures of cracked walls and rusted beds, which stirred a quiet anger in him, not towards Mrs. Margaret or anyone at the orphanage, but towards a system that allowed vulnerable children to live in such conditions. "We'll fix this," Shaq said, his voice firm. "I'll fund the renovation of the orphanage, but I want to do more. I'll find a bigger, safer plot of land, and we'll build a new facility with a medical room and a playground for the kids." Mrs. Margaret's eyes widened, tears streaming down her face. "Mr. O'Neill, this is unbelievable. Why are you doing this?" Shaq smiled, his expression softening. "Because of Emma, because every child deserves a chance, and I know I can make that happen." In the weeks that followed, Shaq threw himself into planning. He met with contractors, lawyers, and friends in finance to kick off his charity, which he called Shaq's House of Hope, a pledge to give every child a safe home and a brighter future. But not everyone was on board. Some of Shaq's business partners expressed concerns about his new direction, fearing it would hurt his personal career and brand image. One branding executive even said, "Shaq, we respect what you're doing, but you're a sports icon, not a full-time philanthropist." Standing tall, Shaq addressed them calmly but resolutely. "I built my name to make a difference. This is how I choose to use it. If this makes anyone uncomfortable, I'll accept the consequences, but I won't turn my back on children in need." The room went quiet, no one daring to challenge him further. After the meeting, Shaq's resolve grew stronger. He knew it wasn't just Emma who needed him. It was an entire community. He wouldn't let them down. Later, he visited Emma in the hospital, where she was sitting up in bed, playing with a picture book Mrs. Margaret had brought. "Emma," Shaq said with a bright smile, "we're going to have a new place soon. A real home for you and your friends, and no one will ever have to be scared again." Emma's eyes lit up with hope. "Promise?" she asked. Shaq leaned in and took her small hand. "I promise." The next day, Shaq went into the hospital's sports store, his large frame filling the narrow aisles. A staff member recognized him immediately. "Hey, Shaq, how can I help you today?" he asked, excitement in his voice. Shaq smiled and bent down to meet the man's gaze. "I need the best basketball you've got, an authentic jersey of mine, and some small gifts for kids." The employee eagerly guided him to the display section. In Shaq's mind, Emma's face appeared vividly. He remembered the fear in her eyes when they first met, but now he also saw the determination in her voice when she asked, "Do you promise?" Shaq wanted to do more to bring her some joy during these tough times. That afternoon, Shaq returned to the hospital with a bag full of gifts. He ran into Mrs. Margaret in the hallway, chatting with a nurse. "Shaq, what's all that you're carrying?" she asked curiously. Shaq winked and grinned. "Just wait and see. We're throwing a surprise party for Emma today." Mrs. Margaret chuckled, the tension easing from her face. When Shaq entered Emma's room, she was sitting against her pillows, clutching a worn-out teddy bear. She looked up, eyes wide with surprise when she saw him. "Hey, Emma, I've got a surprise for you," Shaq announced, excitement in his voice. He placed the bag on her bed and started pulling out the gifts one by one. First came a signed basketball. Emma stared at it in awe. "I signed it just for you," Shaq said warmly. "This isn't just for playing. It's a good luck charm. Every time you look at it, remember you're a warrior too." Emma's eyes sparkled with pride. Then Shaq pulled out an official jersey with his number 34 on the back. "This is the Team Shaq uniform. If you're up for it, you'll be the honorary captain of the team." Emma giggled, her face lighting up with joy. The biggest surprise, however, was yet to come. Shaq pulled out a DVD. "Now it's time for a movie night. Have you ever seen Space Jam *?" Emma shook her head, curiosity lighting her face. Shaq laughed. "Well, you're in for a treat." He asked Mrs. Margaret for help setting up a TV. Soon, Emma's room was transformed into a cozy mini theater. Nurses peeked in, and even some patients from neighboring rooms joined in. Shaq sat next to Emma, remote in hand, ready to start the movie. As the film began, Shaq leaned toward Emma and whispered, "Some of the moves in this movie were inspired by my actual game." Emma giggled, a sweet sound Shaq hadn't heard in weeks. She became engrossed in the movie, occasionally turning to Shaq with questions about the plays or characters. Shaq answered with humor, making her laugh so much that her smile didn't fade. During the movie's climax, Emma whispered, "I want to try as hard as you in the NBA Finals. If you can win, so can I." Shaq's heart swelled with emotion, but he kept his smile steady. He gently patted her hand. "That's right, Captain. We always win when we never give up." Later that evening, when the movie ended, Emma had fallen asleep with a peaceful smile on her face. The signed basketball was at the foot of her bed, and the jersey lay beside her. Shaq stood for a moment, feeling warmth in his heart. As he left, he turned to Mrs. Margaret. "See, sometimes a little joy can help us get through the hardest times." Mrs. Margaret nodded, her eyes full of gratitude. "Shaq, you're not just a champion on the court. You're a champion of little hearts, like Emma's." Shaq smiled, but inside, he knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The next morning, as Shaq left the hospital after a sleepless night, he felt brighter than the misty morning sky. He had just shared an unforgettable evening with Emma, the little girl who had finally begun to smile again after weeks of fear. His phone buzzed constantly with new notifications. Marcus, Shaq's longtime driver, glanced at him in the rearview mirror with a knowing smile. "Boss, you're more famous now than ever before." Shaq unlocked his phone and saw a series of news headlines. "Shaquille O'Neal brings hope to little Emma. A heartwarming tale." Shaq puts career on hold to help save children's lives. He sighed, a mix of pride and discomfort. He hadn't done this for recognition, but if the attention could help him bring more support, he would use it to help even more children in need. The days ahead held even more opportunities for him to make a difference. The tale of Shaquille O'Neal and Emma quickly spread through media outlets and social networks. Journalists, charity organizations, and people from all walks of life expressed their admiration. Messages flooded in from entrepreneurs, athletes, and even regular fans, all asking the same question: "How can I help?" A young entrepreneur made a generous donation along with a letter, saying, "Shaq, you've inspired me, and I want to help make Emma's dreams come true, along with those of other children." Another athlete texted, "If you ever need someone to play basketball with the kids, count me in." Even young fans sent handwritten letters, drawings, and small gifts, hoping to contribute to this important cause. Motivated by the overwhelming support, Shaq decided to organize a major fundraiser in the heart of the city. He knew this wasn't just an opportunity to raise funds, but also a chance to spread a message of hope and love. The venue sparkled under bright lights, hosting hundreds of attendees from business leaders and famous artists to everyday citizens. The stage was decorated with a basketball theme, featuring the logo of Shaq's newly created charity, Shaq's House of Hope. Shaq walked onto the stage to thunderous applause, bowed his head in acknowledgement, and took the microphone. "Good evening, everyone," he began. "I've been blessed with a great career, but I've learned that the most meaningful part of life isn't titles or success. It's how we use those blessings to help others." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room. "I want to thank each and every one of you for being here tonight. We're not just helping Emma, we're building a brighter future for hundreds of other children." The crowd erupted in applause. Shaq wasn't done, though. He turned to a door at the side of the stage and said, "Now, I'd like to introduce someone very special. The little girl who gave me the reason to start this journey, Emma." The door opened, and Emma walked into a wave of cheers. She wore Shaq's number 34 jersey and a basketball cap adorned with the charity's logo. Though still frail, her eyes sparkled and her radiant smile left the audience silent with emotion. Emma joined Shaq on stage, and he bent down to hand her the microphone. She held it tightly, her small but steady voice filling the room. "Thank you all for being here. I know I couldn't do this alone, but because of Uncle Shaq and all of you, I know I can win." She paused, taking a deep breath before adding, "I will win for everyone here." The crowd erupted in cheers, tears streaming down faces, from strangers to Shaq's closest friends. As the event concluded, Shaq and Emma sat in a quiet corner. Emma looked up at him, her smile tired but content. "Today was amazing, Uncle Shaq. I'm not scared anymore." Shaq placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his warm smile lighting up his face. "That's because you're a warrior, Emma, and warriors are never alone." That night, Shaq didn't just feel the success of the fundraiser. He felt the deeper meaning of his work. His journey with Emma was just beginning, but with the community's support, he knew anything was possible. In the days following the fundraiser, Shaq continued visiting Emma at the hospital. Each time he entered her room, his infectious energy seemed to lift every worry, even as her chemotherapy took a toll. Her hair had fallen out, her skin looked pale, and she was often too tired to leave her bed. One day, when Shaq arrived, he found Emma curled up on the bed, staring blankly out the window. "Hey, Captain," Shaq greeted, trying to sound cheerful, holding up a colorful bag. "I brought treasures today. Guess what's inside?" Emma barely turned her head. Instead of her usual smile, she gave a faint shake of her head. Shaq sat beside her and opened the bag. "I've got pizza, the extra cheesy kind, and comic books. Batman vs. Joker, but if you want, I can narrate it like a basketball game. Who do you think wins?" Emma tried to smile, but it faded quickly. "I don't want pizza or comic books," she murmured. "I'm too tired, Uncle Shaq." Shaq's heart clenched, but he masked his pain with a bright expression. "That's okay. If you don't want pizza now, we'll save it for later. And as for the Batman vs. Joker game, you just have to listen. I'll make it the best play-by-play ever." He began narrating, his deep, warm voice filled with humor, miming exaggerated basketball moves, pretending to dunk on an imaginary Joker. Emma let out a small laugh, but it quickly faded. As the story ended, Emma sighed deeply. "Uncle Shaq," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "if I don't make it, will you be sad?" Her question hit Shaq like a knife to the chest. He froze for a moment, his large hands clenching to hold back his emotions, but he wouldn't let Emma see his pain. "Emma," he said, his voice steady and firm, "I would be sad, but do you know what? No one gives up when Uncle Shaq is on their team. We're a team, and our team always wins, no matter how tough it gets." Emma looked at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "But I'm so tired, Uncle Shaq. I'm afraid I'll let everyone down." Shaq leaned in, taking her small hand in his massive one. "Listen to me, Emma," he said. "Everyone gets tired. Everyone gets scared. But what matters is that we keep going. Every single day you fight, you make me proud. No one, especially you, has ever let anyone down. You're the bravest person I've ever met." Her faint smile returned, though tears still glistened in her eyes. The challenges didn't stop. Emma's immune system began to falter, leaving her vulnerable to infections. One evening, after Shaq had left the hospital, he received a frantic call from Mrs. Margaret. "Shaq, Emma spiked a high fever and has been moved to isolation for monitoring. The doctors say it's a dangerous complication from the chemotherapy." Shaq rushed to the hospital. He was instructed to wear protective gear before entering the isolation room. Seeing Emma lying there, her tiny body almost swallowed by blankets, surrounded by machines, made his heart ache. He sat beside her, unable to touch her but speaking through the mask. "Emma, you're doing so well. Just hang in there a little longer. Everything will be okay." She slowly opened her eyes and whispered, "Promise?" Shaq placed his hand over his chest. "I promise." After several tense days, Emma began to recover. Though still fragile, her spirit seemed lighter, buoyed by Shaq's unwavering support. One afternoon, Shaq entered her room to find Emma trying to sit up. A basketball signed by him was placed carefully on the bedside table as a symbol of hope. "You know," Shaq said with a warm smile, "I just came up with a new drill. It's called bed dribbling. Want to give it a try?" Emma chuckled, genuinely laughing. "Okay, but you have to help me. I can't do it on my own." Shaq leaned in, his eyes sparkling with joy. "That's why captains always have co-captains, Emma. We'll do this together." The room filled with soft laughter as they practiced their dribbling drill. In that moment, Shaq felt they'd won another small victory in their long, arduous journey. Spring sunlight filtered through the hospital window, illuminating the room where Emma had spent countless days fighting. Beside her bed, the signed basketball sat as a symbol of hope. Shaq walked in, his broad shoulders nearly filling the doorway. Emma, now sitting up, looked rosier, her smile brighter. "Looks like my team captain is stronger than ever," Shaq teased. Emma laughed, her eyes sparkling. "I told you I'd win, Uncle Shaq." After months of chemotherapy and radiation, Emma received the long-awaited news. The cancer cells were under control, and she was entering recovery. Though the road ahead was long, being discharged from the hospital and returning to the orphanage marked a major milestone. Mrs. Margaret and the orphanage staff decided to throw a small welcome-back party. When Shaq heard about it, he insisted on attending and planned a big surprise. That day, the orphanage buzzed with joy, colorful balloons hanging everywhere, and children's laughter echoing. Emma arrived in a simple white dress with her familiar basketball cap. Her friends cheered as she arrived, and Emma couldn't hide her emotion as the crowd clapped to welcome her home. Shaq, dressed in a simple suit that still couldn't disguise his towering presence, stepped up beside Emma, holding a microphone. Today, he began, "We're not just welcoming Captain Emma back, but also celebrating her incredible courage and resilience. Emma, you're not just a hero to yourself. You're an inspiration to all of us." The crowd erupted into applause, but Shaq wasn't finished. He raised his hand for quiet, and to make sure every child here, not just Emma, has a safe home, a place where they'll never have to worry about their health or future, I have some good news. He paused. "I've purchased a new plot of land, much bigger, and we're going to build a modern orphanage with an on-site medical clinic. This will be a place where you all can feel secure, happy, and have everything you need to grow." The children squealed with delight, their cheers echoing in the room. Emma stood, her hand clutching Shaq's, her face glowing. "Thank you, Uncle Shaq. You really did it for us." Shaq smiled and knelt beside her, holding her hands. "We did it, Emma. I'll always be here for you, no matter what." And as they watched the celebration unfold, both knew that this was only the beginning of an unbreakable bond formed through love, compassion, and the promise of hope.